Pascal's wager is a famous philosophical argument proposed by Blaise Pascal, a brilliant French mathematician and philosopher of the 17th century. Pascal argued that it is rational to believe in God, or at least live as if God exists, regardless of whether we have definitive proof of God's existence. This argument focuses on potential outcomes rather than evidence. Pascal framed this as a decision matrix with four possible outcomes based on two key factors: whether we choose to believe in God and whether God actually exists. If you believe in God and God actually exists, Pascal argued you receive infinite reward, eternal salvation in heaven. If you don't believe in God but God actually exists, you face infinite loss, eternal punishment in hell. If you believe in God but God doesn't exist, you experience only finite loss, perhaps missing out on some worldly pleasures. If you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, you gain finite benefits, enjoying worldly pleasures without constraint. Pascal's key insight was that when facing infinite stakes, infinite reward versus infinite punishment, the only rational choice is to believe in God, regardless of the probability of God's existence. Pascal called this a wager because, like placing a bet, we must make a choice about God's existence without having complete certainty. He argued that even if the probability of God existing seems low, the infinite reward makes belief the rational bet. This raises important questions. What does it actually mean to live righteously? And what are the practical implications of making this wager? These questions lead us to examine the real-world scenarios of Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager forces us to consider a fundamental question: what are the consequences of living righteously versus not living righteously? Let's examine this through a decision matrix that shows all possible outcomes. This matrix shows the four possible scenarios we face when making moral choices about how to live our lives. When you choose to live righteously, both possible outcomes are positive. If God exists, you receive eternal reward. If God doesn't exist, you've still lived a moral and honorable life. The potential for infinite gain through eternal paradise makes this choice compelling from a mathematical perspective. Now let's examine what happens if you choose not to live righteously. If you choose not to live righteously, the outcomes are asymmetrical. If God exists, you face potentially infinite loss. If God doesn't exist, you gain only temporary worldly pleasures. Pascal argued that we cannot avoid making this choice. Everyone must decide how to live their life. There is no neutral position in this wager. Even choosing not to believe or not to live righteously is itself a choice with consequences. Pascal believed that reason alone cannot prove or disprove God's existence. Therefore, we must consider the potential consequences of our choices. This limitation of reason is what makes the wager necessary. Since we cannot know with certainty, we must weigh the potential consequences of our choices. In summary, choosing to live righteously appears to offer the best outcomes regardless of whether God exists, making it the rational choice, according to Pascal. While Pascal's wager presents an intriguing argument, it faces several significant criticisms from philosophers and theologians. Three primary criticisms challenge the foundation of Pascal's wager: the problem of many gods, the authenticity of forced belief, and the divine omniscience paradox. The problem of many gods asks a fundamental question: which deity should you wager on? With thousands of religions and countless interpretations of divine beings, Pascal's wager doesn't specify which god deserves your faith. Choosing the wrong deity could result in the same eternal punishment the wager seeks to avoid. Another significant criticism concerns whether genuine belief can be manufactured through rational decision-making. Critics argue that authentic religious belief cannot simply be decided upon. True faith typically emerges from personal experience, cultural background, or spiritual conviction, not from calculating potential outcomes. Richard Dawkins presents perhaps the most pointed criticism: an omniscient God would easily detect insincere belief. If God truly possesses infinite knowledge, then any attempt to fake belief for personal gain would be immediately transparent, rendering the entire wager strategy useless. Despite these criticisms, modern philosophers have found new relevance in Pascal's wager through decision theory and expected value calculations. Contemporary decision theorists recognize Pascal's wager as an early example of expected utility theory, where rational agents maximize expected outcomes under uncertainty. Some contemporary philosophers have reinterpreted Pascal's wager in the context of technological advancement and consciousness preservation. This reinterpretation suggests that rather than betting on supernatural salvation, rational agents might instead invest in developing technologies that could preserve consciousness and achieve a form of technological immortality. Despite valid criticisms, Pascal's wager remains philosophically significant, challenging us to examine the relationship between reason and faith in making life's most consequential decisions.